Hello, everybody. This is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. All right, let's go ahead and let's continue with chapter 2 of the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. There, it chronicles what's considered close encounters of the second kind. Remember, this is stuff involving actual evidence. So, either stuff that people find themselves with the UFOs, or in some cases, some of the stuff that left behind, including, like, let's say, landmarks or burns or something else associated with the UFO. But yes, I had talked about several examples already. This chapter, we're going to start this part 2, with knee-deep examples again associated with close encounters of the second kind. And then, as always, I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. Lots of great stuff to share. I'm really loving this book. I'll include the link below in case you wanted to read it on your own for free as well. So let's go ahead and let's share this part 2, and then I'll give again my own thoughts and comments on it afterwards. So here's what it states. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. Towards the end of December 1980, an event occurred that has come to be regarded as the most significant in the history of British ufology. Although, depending on those whose testimony one takes as the most reliable, it could be considered as a close encounter of a third kind, the sighting of alien entities. The Rendlesham incident is most significant for the measurable physical traces left behind by the UFO. In 1980, the Twin Royal Air Force bases of Woodbridge and Brent Walkers in Suffolk, owned by the Ministry of Defense but staffed by the U.S. Air Force, formed a vital component of the NATO defenses in Europe. On the night of December 27th, 2 USAF security personnel were patrolling the area around the Eastgate sector of RAF Woodbridge. They observed the light moving to the trees in adjoining Rendlesham Forest, and thinking that it might be an aircraft in trouble, they radioed back to their superiors. Although no aircraft were flying that night, both the Woodbridge Control Tower and the Radar Defense Unit at RAF Wanton had locked onto a target approaching from the north. And 3 more security personnel were then dispatched to investigate. Searching the defense forest in the enveloping darkness, they eventually came to a large clearing in which they saw a glowing triangular object resting on 3 struts in a tripod arrangement. The surface of the object had a peculiar quilted appearance, although it seemed metallic. There was a large red light at its apex and a bank of intense blue lights around the base. As the airmen approached, the object glided away across the clearing. The airmen were not the only ones to be stunned by what they were seeing. Nearby farm animals became panic-stricken and virtually stampeded into a lane behind the field. In an official memorandum to the Ministry of Defense, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, described the investigation of the area that was conducted the following day. There were 3 depressions, 1.5 feet deep and 7 feet in diameter, that were found where the object had been sighted on the ground. The following night, December 29, 1980, the area was checked for radiation. Beta-gamma ratings of 0.1 milliroentgens were recorded with peak readings in the 3 depressions near the center of the triangle formed by the depressions. A nearby tree had moderate readings on the side of the tree towards the depression. The mysterious object returned to Rendlesham Forest that night and was witnessed by Colonel Halt and others, as the final paragraph of his memorandum states. A red, sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles and then broke into 5 separate white objects and then disappeared. Immediately thereafter, 3 star-like objects were noticed in the sky, 2 objects to the north and then 1 to the south, all of which were about 10 degrees off to the horizon. The objects moved rapidly in sharp, angular movements and displayed red, green, and blue lights. The objects to the north appeared to be elliptical, though in 8 to 12 power lens, though they then turned to be full circles. The objects to the north remained in the sky for an hour or more. The object to the south was visible for 2 or 3 hours and then beamed down a stream of light from time to time. Numerous individuals, including the undersigned, witnessed these activities. According to the skeptics, these bizarre light formations were actually caused by the lighthouse at Orford Ness, about 5 miles away. However, this explanation seems rather facile in view of the fact that the USAF personnel had dimly spied the lighthouse beam while they were searching for the object in the forest and had recognized it for what it was. Apart from this, it seems extremely unlikely that highly trained servicemen would mistake such a thing for a metallic triangular object resting a few feet away from them on 3 landing struts. In addition, lighthouse beams are not generally known for their ability to leave traces of beta and gamma radiation. According to Airman Lawrence Warren, who was also present at the time of the landing, alien entities were visible inside the object. As he approached the UFO, Warren became aware that time seemed to be flowing at half speed. A small object detached itself from the larger craft before splitting into 3. Warren claims to have been able to see beings with large eyes inside these smaller objects. At that point, says Warren, Colonel Gordon Williams, the overall base commander, entered the field and actually attempted to communicate with the beings by holding up his arms in a questioning manner. There was a sudden sharp noise, and the entities raised their own arms, either in reply or perhaps for protection. A protective membrane then slid over their eyes, and they got real bright. There were apparently a great many military personnel in the field equipped with video cameras and other recording equipment. In an interview with British ufologist Timothy Good, Warren estimated that there were about 80 people present before the security police were dismissed. Apparently, Warren and some of the others were deeply disturbed by what they had seen. His retinas had been damaged by the intense lights, and he even ended up with a shock of gray hair. He also told Good that during his debriefing following the encounter, he and other security police were shown a 15-minute film of UFOs taken during the Second World War and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The reason for this was allegedly to justify the extreme secrecy surrounding the UFO phenomenon. The Rendlesham incident is important not only for the measurable physical traces left behind by the UFOs, but also as an example of how the authorities do cover up such encounters. The Halt Memorandum describing the UFO activity and the radiation traces left behind was sent to the Ministry of Defense via Squadron Leader Donald Moreland, commander of the neighboring base at Bent Waters. While researching their book about the incident Sky Crash, which was co-authored with Jeannie Randalls, Brenda Butler and Dot Street met with Moreland in February 1981 and were told by him that he knew nothing about any incident at Woodbridge. It was not until 1983 that the Halt Memorandum was released under the American Freedom of Information Act. It was rather ironic that British researchers had to wait for a document describing events occurring on British soil to be released in America before the Ministry of Defense even admitted that anything unusual had happened and that the memorandum was in their files, after all. Incredible as it may seem, this document, released to Robert Todd of the U.S. group Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, is claimed by the MOD to be the only documentation they have on the Rendlesham incident. Although questions are asked in the House of Commons, the British government insisted that they took no action following the events in December 1980. As Jenny Randall states, if this were true, it would constitute an appalling neglect of duty in the defense of British territory. If, on the other hand, the MOD did take steps in response to this apparent intrusion by an unidentified craft, then why is official secrecy being maintained? Next segment is titled Burned by a UFO. Although radiation traces left on vegetation after a UFO sighting are impressive enough, when physical evidence is discovered on the bodies of the witnesses themselves, the events become truly disturbing and virtually impossible to dismiss as a misidentification or hoax. One such event happened in Texas on the night of December 29, 1980, around the time that U.S. airmen were puzzling over the mysterious intruder in Rendlesham Forest. At 9 p.m., a solitary car was driving along the lonely Cleveland-Huffman Road, north of Lake Houston, headed for Dayton, Texas. In the car were Betty Cash, a 51-year-old restaurant and grocery store owner, Vicky Landrum, who was 57, who worked in Betty's restaurant, and then Colby Landrum, which was Vicky's 7-year-old grandson. The night was cold, the temperature 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they had the car's heater on. Colby was the first to see the UFO gliding just above the treetops. At first, they assumed it was an ordinary aircraft, but as it gradually drew closer, they realized that the object was anything but ordinary. As it approached the road on which they were traveling, they could see that it was a large, diamond-shaped, and emitted a very bright light that was punctuated occasionally by a burst of fire, like a rocket exhaust from its underside. The UFO was now dead ahead of them, and Vicky screamed at Betty to stop the car, believing that if they passed underneath the object, they would be burned alive. As the three stunned witnesses watched, the UFO continued to hover erratically about 60 yards away, losing height, letting forth another rocket blast, and then rising again. Vicky described it as a diamond of fire. It appeared to be made of material like dull aluminum. The glow from it was so bright that it lit up the surrounding countryside. The points of the diamond were rounded rather than sharp, and its central line was ringed with blue lights. In addition, the UFO emitted a beeping sound. The three witnesses left the car to observe the object. Despite assurances that it would not hurt him, Colby was extremely frightened, so his grandmother got back into the car with him. Betty continued to watch the UFO from outside in spite of the intense heat it was generating until Vicky screamed at her to return to the car. When she tugged on the driver's door handle, it was so hot that she recoiled and had to use her coat as protection to get the door open. Inside the car, the temperature was so great that they had to switch on the air conditioner. Presently, the UFO rose into the night sky and then left the area. Incredibly, the witnesses saw that it was being pursued by about 20 large helicopters. According to Betty, they seemed to rush in from all directions. It seemed like they were trying to encircle the thing. As Betty started the car and they continued their journey home, they could still see the receding object, a gradually fading light ascending into the sky. The helicopters were still clearly in pursuit. Some of them were illuminated by the object. The witnesses described some of them as having 4 wheels and 2 rotor blades, which implies that they were Boeing CH-47 Chinooks. Others were much smaller, single rotorcraft, which might have been Bell Hueys. Badly shaken by their experience, the witnesses continued on to Vicky and Colby's house, where Betty dropped them off before returning to her home. The time was approximately 9:50 p.m. The fear engendered in the witnesses was far from over, however. They all began to feel ill upon their return home, suffering from headaches and nausea. Perhaps because she had been outside the car for the longest, Betty fared worse, with swelling of the neck and red blotches on her face and head. In the days that followed, these symptoms worsened, with the blotches turning into blisters. Betty also began to suffer from diarrhea, and her eyes swelled shut. All 3 witnesses had to be admitted to hospitals for treatment. Betty was treated as a burn victim. During her 12 days there, patches of her skin fell off and some of her hair fell out. Vicky and Colby also suffered considerably from swollen eyes, diarrhea, hair loss, which was eventually replaced by hair of a different frizzy texture, anorexia, and diminished vision. According to Lawrence Fawcett and Barry Greenwood in their book Clear Intent, the Cash Landrum encounter was investigated by John Schlesler, a project manager for space shuttle flight operations for the McDonnell Douglas Corporation, and a deputy director for administration for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, in Seguin, Texas. Schlesler came to the conclusion that the symptoms were consistent with radiation sickness, although he wasn't able to say exactly what type of radiation was involved. It is possible, however, that they were exposed to ultraviolet radiation. This ionization radiation is the most dangerous to living tissues and causes exactly the symptoms suffered by the witnesses. Non-ionizing radiation, as from microwaves, also causes irritating skin, particularly if there are pulse, which plagued Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Attempts were also made to discover where the helicopters had come from. An official at the Houston Intercontinental Airport Federation Aviation Administration said that all of the roughly 400 helicopters operating commercially in the Houston area were single rotor types. There were no double rotor CH-47 Chinooks. A reporter from the Corpus Christi Caller asked the press officer at the U.S. Armistice Fort Hood near Killeen, Texas, whether they had any aircraft in the vicinity of the encounter on the night of December 29, 1980. He replied there were none, but qualified this by adding, "I don't know any other place around here that would have that number of helicopters. I don't know what it could be unless there's a super secret thing going on, and I wouldn't necessarily know about it." All of the other military bases in Texas and Louisiana, when contacted, denied having any helicopters in the area at the time of the encounter. Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not alone in witnessing these helicopters, however. L.L. Walker, a police officer from Dayton, Texas, told Schlesler that he had seen a large number of helicopters flying in groups of 3, with their searchlights on, several hours after the encounter on the Cleveland-Huffman Road. According to Walker, the helicopters, which he identified as Chinooks, seemed to be searching for something. In clear intent, Fawcett and Greenwood asked the questions that demand to be asked. Why were the helicopters chasing a UFO? Were they actually attempting to capture it? If it really was an alien vehicle that was experiencing some kind of trouble, did they succeed? Or was the object actually an experimental human-built craft that had gone out of control? Whatever the ultimate answer, the presence of the CH-47 Chinook strongly implies military involvement with the UFO. Believing that the object was definitely American in origin, Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum decided to sue the government for $20 million in damages. In August 1986, the case was finally dismissed on the grounds that no such object was owned or operated by the Army, Air Force, Navy, or NASA. John Schlesler was far from satisfied with this outcome since the evidence regarding the presence of the Chinooks was ignored, the judge settling for the testimony of government experts as providing sufficient grounds to dismiss the case. Next segment, the landing at Trans-en-Provence. Ironically enough, the Trans-en-Provence, southern France encounter was brief, perhaps even run-of-the-mill as far as UFO encounters go, and yet it qualifies as perhaps the most impressive case of its kind on record. The reason for this was that a larger number of professional scientists actually bothered to examine the evidence, something that very rarely happens in UFO sighting cases. At about 5 p.m. on January 8, 1981, Renato Nicolai, 55 and retired due to ill health, was working in his garden. The garden was rather unusual in that it was on 4 levels or terraces. Nikolai's attention was drawn to a whistling noise behind him, and he turned to see a small, saucer-shaped object descending toward the ground. Since he was on one of the garden's lower terraces, Nikolai quickly climbed towards the uppermost section for a better view of the strange machine. The UFO then took off, kicking up some dust from the ground, and ascended to treetop level, revealing 4 openings in its underside from which neither smoke nor flames was emitted. It then headed in the direction of the forest of Trans-en-Provence. As he walked toward the landing site, he noticed a circle about 2 meters in diameter. Nikolai described the object as being just about 1.5 meters high, and it was the color of lead. According to police who examined the landing site the following day, we observed the presence of 2 concentric circles, one 2.2 meters in diameter and the other 2.4 meters in diameter. The 2 circles form a sort of corona, 10 centimeters thick. There are 2 parts clearly visible, and they also show black striations. Nikolai thought he saw 2 kinds of round pieces, which could have been landing gear or feet, as the UFO took off. He felt no heat, no vibration, no illness, neither during the observation nor after. He was simply very impressed by the inexplicable spectacle. The sighting was investigated by the French group Japan, which has been established by the government in 1977. Japan was unique among UFO investigation programs as it was actually a part of the Centre National d'Études Spatiales, the French National Space Agency, an equivalent of NASA in the United States, and had access to laboratories all over the country. Even the military were officially obliged to cooperate with the program. The police had taken samples of the vegetation around the landing site, which Japan took for biochemical analysis. Having checked with both civil and military aviation authorities that the UFO had not been a man-made aircraft, Japan took further samples of vegetation at various distances from the landing site, as well as closely examining the site itself. This revealed that the soil had been tightly compacted. Pieces of flint in the soil had been fractured, either through intense pressure or extreme temperatures. In this report on the case, based on research conducted at the universities of Metz and Ranguel, Japan stated, the methods of analysis and microscopic observation brought out elements that indicate that the terrain or soil where Nikolai claims to have observed the phenomenon underwent certain specific modifications. There was a strong mechanical pressure forced on the surface, probably the result of a heavy weight. The appearance of a superficial structural modification of the soil with both striations and erosions and a thermatic heating of the soil, perhaps consecutive to or immediately following the shock, the value of which did not exceed 600 degrees centigrade. An eventual residue of material in the form of detectable traces of the sample analyzed, such as a weak quantity of oxidous iron on grains of calcium and minute quantities of phosphate and zinc. The plant specimens were analyzed at the National Institute of Agronomy Research in Avignon. According to biochemist Professor Michael Bonioz, the specimens at the landing site, as opposed to others of the same strain used as a control, exhibited alterations that might be consistent with an electromagnetic source of stress. The amount of mutilation or transformation is a function of distance from the center. However, Professor Bonioz conceded that the amount of information yielded from the plant deformations was too scattered to form a whole picture, so that as of this moment, we cannot give a precise and unique interpretation of this remarkable combination of results. He remained confident, nevertheless, that something did indeed land at Trans-en-Provence on January 8, 1981. Perhaps the most striking conclusions of the analysis were that the leaves of the plant had the anatomic and physiologic characteristics of their age, but had the biochemical characteristics of advanced senescence of old age, and this does not resemble anything known to exist. As Professor Bonioz stated, something certainly happened, something which resulted in measurable but inexplicable physical traces and biochemical effects. If we combine this hard scientific evidence with Ronaldo Nicolai's description of the cause as a saucer-shaped object landing in its garden, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that Nicolai witnessed a concrete, objective phenomenon. Where that phenomenon came from and where it went are still unanswered questions. And that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause this here. This is again part 2 of chapter 2, Close Encounters of the Second Kind. So far, pretty good stuff, right? When it comes to this chapter, lots of good examples of physical evidence left from UFOs. First off, the Rendlesham Forest incident. That was pretty neat too. Here you had something that was, I don't know, something along the lines of a triangle, and at the same time it had this weird quilted appearance, but it left a really, really deep impression, 1.5 feet deep and then 7 inches in 7 feet in diameter, which is kind of crazy because it shows you the mass or the weight that this thing had, and the fact that this thing, whatever it was, actually returned to the forest, the same thing, the same location basically, on that night. So it went there twice, and it was seen by so many people. Goes to show that this is why it remains such a really, really good example. And the fact that here you had something involving almost a close encounter of the third kind with some beings there inside some of those crafts, and then one of those guys, Colonel Gordon Williams, almost communicating with them, holding up his arms, and they in turn held up their arms. That was pretty interesting stuff. The scary story, though, was the one that was titled Burned by a UFO. Interesting that this happened there in Texas. I have not talked about this one. I may feature it in one of my later articles or one of my later videos here, because you know me, I love being able to go to certain locations, and here you have something that was north of Lake Houston. So maybe if I'm in the Houston area, I'm going to try to go to that road that it occurred on and see what happened. But here you have a situation where they encountered a large diamond-shaped UFO, very bright lights, but whatever was causing its heat, whatever it was, as one of the people there described it, a diamond of fire, it ended up causing them, all three of them, great harm. I mean, here you have one of them being treated as a burn victim. There you have swelling of the throat, skin falling off, hair falling off as well, swollen eyes, diarrhea, anorexia, diminished vision. I mean, that's scary stuff. They didn't feel that at first, but they definitely felt that afterward. And the fact that it almost has a tie-in to some kind of radiation or ionizing radiation, that's scary stuff too. I mean, having seen that wonderful documentary show, I guess you could call it a documentary, called Chernobyl, there it showcases the effects of radiation. That is truly scary stuff. You never want to have anything like that happen to you at all. But the fact that it occurred to those three victims, and they tried to sue the government for it, and it was dismissed because obviously there was no evidence that was going to be presented that would help their case, but at the same time reveal things from the government, that's not going to work. So poor victims, this was definitely a lose-lose situation for them. And then the last segment, that landing at Trans-en-Provence, interesting stuff, especially with regards to the analyzation. It got a little technical. I didn't really understand that heavily some of the stuff that they were stating, but the key thing was, the sense that I got was, the soil was supposed to be a certain age, but the evidence shows that whatever was on top of it, that UFO, caused it to age even quicker. Nothing like that, as it was stated, does not resemble anything known to exist. So talk about rock solid proof when it comes to type of effects that a UFO has on its surroundings. Let me know what you guys think, though. Post those comments below. Interesting stuff when it comes to this chapter, part 2 of Close Encounters of the Second Kind. I'll do another one soon. That'll be part 3. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.